The fleet is waiting.
A new era begins.
Fleet Marshal Kaion Vell had spent 11 days staring at the human border, waiting for an order to advance that he had begun. In the private and unspoken corner of his mind reserved for doubts, an Ilkari warden was never supposed to have, to hope would never come. The Grand Fleet sat coiled along the edge of a border system the humans called Meridian Watch. 400 warships arranged in the precise, overwhelming formation that had preceded every conquest the Voranth Imperium had undertaken in 3 centuries of expansion. And Vell had commanded enough of those conquests to know exactly what the coming days were meant to look like. He did not expect the transmission that reached his flagship instead. It arrived not through any tactical channel, but through the Imperium's own administrative relay network, flagged with a priority code Vell had seen used perhaps twice in 30 years of service. A designation reserved for communications directly from the Emperor's court, urgent enough to interrupt any operation in progress, anywhere in Imperial space. He opened it expecting new orders. What he found instead was a request, oddly phrased, from a junior administrative officer he did not recognize, asking, not instructing, a grammatical construction Vell had never once seen used in an official Imperial communication. Whether the Grand Fleet had received any updated directives from the capital in the last 6 hours, because the administrative network had stopped receiving tax remittance confirmations from 11 subject systems simultaneously. And no one at the capital seemed able to explain why. Vell read the message 3 times and felt something cold and unfamiliar settle into his chest. A sensation he did not have a ready name for because it had never, in 30 years of unbroken Imperial dominance, been required of him. "Get me a direct line to the capital," he told his communications officer. "Priority override. I want the Emperor's court, not an administrative relay." The line took 4 hours to establish, far longer than any communication of this priority should have required. And when it finally connected, what answered was not the Emperor's court at all, but a harried junior functionary standing in a control room Vell recognized, from the architecture visible behind her, as the outer administrative complex surrounding the Imperial Palace itself. A woman clearly overwhelmed by circumstances no protocol had prepared her to manage. "Fleet Marshal," she said, and her voice carried the particular strain of someone who had been fielding an unbroken stream of impossible questions for hours longer than she could comfortably sustain. "I cannot connect you to the Emperor's court. I cannot connect anyone to the Emperor's court. The palace administrative staff stopped reporting for duty 6 hours ago, all of them simultaneously across every department. The Emperor himself has not been seen or heard from since early this morning. I do not know what is happening, Fleet Marshal. I only know that every subject world we have attempted to contact in the last 6 hours has either gone silent or has responded with something that is not a status report at all." "Then what has it responded with?" Vell asked, though some quiet, unwelcome part of him had already begun to suspect the answer before she gave it. The functionary's hands were visibly shaking as she pulled up a display and turned it toward the camera, and Vell found himself looking at a broadcast, not military, not administrative, but a simple, defiant declaration repeating on an open channel from a subject world called Dorith Prime, a planet the Imperium had held in unbroken, unquestioned control for over a century. "We are no longer the Voranth Imperiums to command. Effective immediately, the Dorith Assembly declares full independence and formally requests recognition from any galactic body willing to extend it. We do not ask for the Imperium's permission because we no longer believe the Imperium's permission is a thing that was ever real." Vell stared at the words for a long moment and understood, with the particular vertigo of a man watching the entire architecture of his life certainty begin, very quietly to come apart, that the Grand Fleet he commanded had spent 11 days poised to conquer a species that had never once posed the Voranth Imperium's real threat. The real threat, whatever it was, had apparently been sitting quietly inside the Imperium's own foundations the entire time, waiting for the right moment to finally bring the whole structure down. 3 years earlier, and a considerable distance from the Imperial capital, Director Amara Voss had stood in a modest briefing room aboard a United Earth Space Command outpost near the edge of Voranth space, trying to convince a room full of skeptical senior officers that the greatest threat humanity faced from the Imperium could not be answered with a single additional wars. The Voranth Grand Fleet outnumbers our entire deployable military by a factor of 6, she said, pulling up a display that showed the slow, patient advance of Imperial border patrols over the preceding 18 months, each incursion a little deeper, a little bolder, testing the exact edges of how much provocation humanity would tolerate before responding. If this becomes a conventional war, we lose it badly regardless of how cleverly we fight. I've spent the last 4 years studying every scrap of intelligence we've gathered on Imperial internal structure, and I don't believe conventional war is actually the threat we should be preparing for. I believe it's the threat they want us preparing for, because it's the only kind of threat their entire civilization actually knows how to answer. Then what would you have us do instead, Director? Asked Admiral Rios, the ranking officer in the room, his tone carrying the particular patience of a man who had already heard several of Voss's unconventional proposals and remained unconvinced by all of them. Ask them politely to reconsider 3 centuries of expansion. I'd have us understand what actually holds the Imperium together, Voss said. Because it isn't loyalty, Admiral, and it isn't even fear, not really, not anymore, not after 3 centuries. It's information control. Every subject world in Voranth space communicates with the wider Imperium exclusively through relay infrastructure the Imperium itself owns and monitors. Subject species don't know what conditions look like on other subject worlds. They don't know how many Imperial garrisons are actually stationed nearby, or how thin those garrisons have become as the Imperium's expanded further than it can comfortably administer. They don't know, most importantly, that they significantly outnumber their occupiers, because the only story anyone is ever allowed to hear is the one the Imperium chooses to tell them. She let that settle for a moment before continuing. I don't believe we can defeat the Voranth Grand Fleet in open battle, Admiral. I believe if we're patient enough and careful enough, we may not need to. I believe an empire built on controlled information starts to come apart the moment that control genuinely breaks, because there was never actually much holding the rest of it together at all. It took the better part of a year to secure the authorization, and longer still to build the technology Voss's proposal actually required. A small, difficult-to-detect communication relay, built around principles of quantum entanglement that the Imperium's monitoring infrastructure had no established protocol for identifying, capable of connecting subject worlds directly to each other, and crucially, to a small, careful human diplomatic presence willing to share what those worlds asked to know, without demanding anything in return beyond the simple willingness to talk honestly. Voss called it, in the private notes she kept for herself rather than any official command designation, the Lantern Initiative, and she oversaw its careful, patient deployment personally, world by world, over the following 2 years, never announced, never advertised, delivered instead through the same quiet trade relationships human vessels had spent years building along the Imperium's margins. A single relay device smuggled into the hands of a trusted contact on each subject world. Accompanied always by the same simple offer. Not weapons, not promises of rescue. Just a way to talk to each other honestly without the Imperium listening, and access to whatever information they wanted about their own galaxy, about each other, about exactly how thin Imperial control had actually become in the century since the last major expansion. You're not giving them a rebellion, Admiral Rio said, during one of the increasingly candid briefings Voss delivered as the initiative expanded, his skepticism having slowly, grudgingly given way to something closer to reluctant respect. You're just giving them a mirror. That's exactly it, Admiral, Voss said. I've come to believe most empires like the Voranth Imperium survive less on genuine strength than on the carefully maintained belief in every subject population that resistance is both impossible and unthinkable. Break that belief honestly and without coercion, and I don't think you need an army to bring the rest of it down. I think it comes down on its own, the moment enough people simply realize at the same time that it always could have. Senna Iller had been 11 years old when the last Doroth uprising failed, and she remembered, with the particular clarity childhood memories of fear tend to carry into adulthood, exactly what the Imperium's response had looked like. A single city, chosen at random from among a dozen that had shown signs of unrest, subjected to a punitive blockade that lasted 4 months and cost, by careful Imperial design, just enough lives tea. Oh, make the lesson unmistakable, without quite crossing into the kind of atrocity that might have drawn outside attention. She had grown up understanding, the way every Doroth child understood, that the Imperium was not merely powerful but eternal. Its rule not a political arrangement but a fact of the universe as fixed and unchangeable as gravity, and that the handful of elders who still spoke, quietly and only among trusted family, about a Doroth Prime that had once governed itself were indulging in a kind of grief that had long since curdled into fantasy. She was 34, running a modest agricultural cooperative on the outskirts of the Doroth capital, when a trader she had done careful, cautious business with for several years handed her, along with a routine shipment of imported grain, a small, unremarkable device, and a set of instructions that unsettled her more than anything she had encountered since childhood. It talks to other worlds, the trader told her, a weathered human woman who called herself simply Reina and who Senna had never once in 3 years of dealings suspected of anything beyond ordinary commerce. Not through Imperial relays around them. Nobody's listening but whoever you choose to talk to. I'm not asking you to do anything with it, Senna. I'm just asking if you'd like to know some things the Imperiums never let you know before. Senna kept the device hidden for 11 days before she found the courage to activate it. And when she finally did, alone in the back room of her cooperative storage facility late at night, what she found on the other end of that quiet, unmonitored channel changed the shape of everything she had believed about her own world's place in the galaxy. She found other Doroth, first, voices from settlements on the far side of her own planet she had never had any means of contacting directly, sharing stories of Imperial garrison strength that, compiled together for the first time in a century, revealed a startling and previously invisible truth. The actual occupying force on Doroth Prime numbered barely 12,000, spread thin across a planet of nearly 200 million, maintained not through overwhelming physical presence, but through the totalizing belief, carefully cultivated for a century, that resistance anywhere would be met with retaliation everywhere. She found, further out, voices from other subject worlds entirely, species she had only ever heard mentioned in careful, controlled Imperial broadcasts as examples of the Imperium's benevolent order, worlds carrying their own version of the same quiet realization, the same slow, dawning understanding that the story they had been told about their own powerlessness had never actually matched the numbers underneath it. And she found, eventually, a small, careful human presence on the other end of some of those channels, offering nothing beyond information and the patient willingness to answer honest questions, never once pushing her toward any particular action, never once suggesting that human interests required anything of her at all. "Why are you doing this?" she asked Director Voss directly, several months into their careful, growing correspondence, during one of the rare exchanges that reached beyond simple information sharing into something like genuine conversation. "What does your species actually want from mine?" Honestly, Voss told her, "I want the Voranth Imperium to stop being a threat my people have to eventually fight, and I don't believe fighting it is the way that actually happens. I think it happens the way empires like this have always eventually come apart throughout history, everywhere I've ever studied it. Quietly from the inside, the moment enough people realize together that the story holding them in place was never actually true. I'm not asking you to rebel, Senna. I don't think that's my choice to ask for, and I don't think it would work even if I did. I'm just making sure that whenever your people do decide what they want to do with what you're learning, you're deciding it with the real numbers in front of you, instead of the ones the Imperium spent a century convincing you were the only ones that existed. It took the Voranth Assembly, once it finally reconvened for the first time in 3 generations, only 6 months to build a coordinated plan the Imperium's 12,000 garrison troops had no meaningful capacity to prevent, not an armed uprising, which Senna and the Assembly's other newly connected leaders understood from careful study of a dozen other subject worlds' history, tended to give an empire exactly the pretext for violence it needed to reassert control. Instead, something quieter, and in its own way far more difficult to answer. A coordinated planet-wide work stoppage, timed precisely to the moment the Grand Fleet's departure for the human border left Imperial reinforcement capacity at its thinnest point in living memory, in which Eve, Dorath administrator, translator, logistics coordinator, and support worker, the Imperial occupation depended on to actually function simply peacefully, and simultaneously stopped showing up. Fleet Marshal Vell made the decision to abandon the border deployment within 6 hours of receiving the functionary's transmission, a choice that carried, he understood even as he gave the order, considerable personal risk if the situation somehow resolved itself, and the Emperor's court later demanded to know why the Grand Fleet had retreated from a fully prepared conquest without authorization. He found, turning the Grand Fleet back toward the Imperial core, that he did not particularly care about that risk anymore. 30 years of service had built in him a bone-deep instinct for recognizing when an operation's actual objective had shifted beneath him, and every fiber of that instinct was now telling him that whatever was unfolding across Voranth space mattered considerably more than a border skirmish with a young, isolated species that had, he was beginning to suspect, never actually been the Imperium's real problem at all. The Grand Fleet's return journey took 9 days, and by the time Vell's flagship dropped out of transit at the edge of Voranth space, chosen as his first stop specifically because it had been the origin point of the initial Independence broadcast, the picture assembling itself from a steady stream of increasingly chaotic administrative reports had grown almost too large to hold in a single coherent shape. 14 subject worlds had declared independence in the 6 days since Voranth Prime's initial broadcast. Imperial garrison forces on at least 9 of those worlds had reported, with a uniformity that struck Vell as far too consistent to be coincidental, an inability to maintain basic administrative function once local support staff simply stopped appearing for duty. The Emperor's court remained silent, and rumors unconfirmed, but persistent enough that Vell no longer discounted them entirely, suggested the Emperor himself had fled the capital rather than face a palace administrative staff that had, in its own quiet way, joined the same wave of simply, peacefully declining to continue participating in a system it no longer believed required its obedience. Voranth Prime, when Vell's shuttle finally descended toward its capital under a tense, provisional truce negotiated through channels his own command structure had never before needed to establish with a subject world, was not burning. That was, he thought, the detail that unsettled him most as he took in the city spread beneath him. No smoke, no visible battle damage, no sign of the violent uprising every instinct 30 years of Imperial service had trained him to expect. Just an ordinary city going about an ordinary day, except that the Imperial administrative buildings that had governed it for a century now sat conspicuously empty, their windows dark, their functions apparently already being carried out by a hastily but competently assembled local government that had, according to the briefing his intelligence staff had compiled during the journey, been quietly preparing for exactly this transition for the better part of a year. He met Senna Iller in what had once been the Imperial governor's residence, now serving with a directness that struck him as almost deliberately symbolic, as the Voranth Assembly's provisional meeting hall. She received him without the fear he had expected, and without the triumph he had half braced himself against either, only a calm, measured attention that reminded him, uncomfortably, of the demeanor his own most capable subordinates carried into difficult negotiations. "Fleet Marshal," she said, "I imagine you have a great many questions about how a garrison of 12,000 Imperial troops found itself unable to maintain order over 200 million people in less time than it takes most administrations to process a routine grievance. If you're wondering the same thing, Vell was standing there. How exactly an empire that had held unbroken control for 3 centuries could come apart this quietly without a single battle fought to bring it down? That mystery is exactly what the rest of this story is going to unpack. So if you're enjoying it so far, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe for the next HFY story, and drop a comment on whether you think an empire built on fear can ever really recover once its people stop believing the fear is real. Now, back to that provisional meeting hall, because Vell was about to get the answer directly from the person who had helped make it happen. "I would," Vell said. 30 years of service, and I have never once seen an occupation collapse without a shot fired on either side." "That's because it was never really an occupation held together by force, Fleet Marshal," Senna said, "not in any way that could survive being examined honestly. 12 though. Use and troops across a planet this size only ever worked because 200 million people believed, individually and without ever comparing notes, that they were powerless alone and had no way of knowing whether anyone else might stand with them if they tried to act otherwise. That belief was the entire foundation of your Imperium's control here. It was never really about your garrison's strength. It was about our isolation. The moment that isolation broke, the moment we could actually talk to each other honestly and see the real numbers for the first time in 3 generations, the belief that had held us in place simply stopped being true. And once it stopped being true, there was nothing left underneath your administration except people who no longer saw any reason to keep pretending it was inevitable." "You said we could actually talk to each other," Vell said slowly, turning the specifics of her account over with the same careful attention he had once applied to reconstructing an enemy's battle plan from incomplete sensor data. 12,000 troops did not simply forget to monitor your communications, assembly leader. Our relay infrastructure has controlled every channel of interworld communication in Voranth space for over a century. Something broke that control, and I do not believe it was anything your own world developed independently." Senna held his gaze for a long moment before answering, and when she did, something in her measured composure allowed, for the first time, a flicker of genuine warmth. "No," she agreed. "It wasn't. I won't pretend otherwise to you, Fleet Marshal, because I don't believe this conversation benefits from anything less than complete honesty. A human initiative gave us the means to talk to each other freely, roughly 2 years ago, and continued providing information and quiet counsel throughout, without ever once telling us what to do with it. But I want to be equally clear about what that assistance actually was, because I suspect the story your Imperium will eventually tell itself is that humans engineered this collapse deliberately as some kind of covert attack. That isn't what happened. They gave us a mirror, Fleet Marshal. Nothing. Everything we saw reflected in it, our own numbers, our own strength, the actual thinness of the control that had held us for 3 generations, was always true. We simply weren't permitted to see it clearly before." Vell requested, and was granted, a direct communication with Director Amara Voss 2 days later, patched through a relay network that felt, he noted with a kind of grim professional appreciation, considerably more resilient and better organized than anything his own Imperium's engineers had managed to build in 3 centuries of unchallenged dominance. Voss appeared on the display of his flagship's briefing room, with none of the triumphant satisfaction he had half expected from someone whose quiet, patient campaign had apparently just succeeded in bringing down the largest empire humanity had ever encountered. "Fleet Marshal Vell," she said, "I imagine this conversation is not one either of us expected to be having a year ago." "Your species never declared war on my Imperium," Vell said. It was not quite an accusation, though it carried enough of one that Voss did not immediately answer. Every formal channel this Imperium maintains for tracking hostile action against it would register nothing. No fleet movements against us. No sabotage. No assassination. No cyber warfare against our command infrastructure. By every metric my Imperium has ever used to measure a threat, your people did nothing at all. We didn't, Voss agreed. I want to be precise about that, Fleet Marshal, because I think the distinction matters more than it might seem to from where you're standing. We didn't destroy your Imperium. We didn't even weaken it, not in any way a military assessment would recognize. What we did was considerably smaller and considerably harder to defend against, because there was never a clear point at which anyone could have called it an act of war. We gave people who had been deliberately kept from knowing the truth about their own situation the means to learn it for themselves. And we trusted that most people, once they actually understood the numbers, would eventually choose to stop participating in a system that had never really earned their obedience beyond the belief that obedience was their only option. She paused, and something in her steady, measured voice carried the particular weight of someone who had spent a long time considering exactly how to say what came next. I won't pretend to you that I didn't hope for this outcome, Fleet Marshal. I did. But I also want you to understand that nothing about what happened across the last week was manufactured by my species. Every subject world that declared independence made that choice itself, based on information that was already true that we simply made accessible for the first time in a century. If your Imperium's authority genuinely rested on more than fear and isolation, Fleet Marshal, I don't believe a handful of communication relays would have been enough to bring any of it down. Vell sat with that for a long moment, feeling something in the careful, disciplined architecture of his own worldview shift, not collapse exactly, but settle into a shape he had not previously considered possible. You understand, he said finally, that this Imperium built its entire security doctrine around the assumption that any serious threat would come through military escalation. We spent 3 centuries preparing for wars fought with fleets and weapons. We never once considered that the only weapon capable of genuinely ending us would simply be the truth, offered honestly, to people we had spent generations convincing ourselves did not deserve to hear it. I don't think that's a failure unique to your Imperium, Fleet Marshal, Voss said quietly. I think most systems built on controlling what people are allowed to know eventually discover the same thing, usually far too late to do anything about it. The strongest weapon my species has ever found isn't a warship. It's simply refusing to accept that other people's ignorance of their own situation is something worth preserving, even when preserving it would have been considerably easier and considerably safer for everyone involved except the people actually living inside it. The Imperial capital, when Vell's flagship finally reached it 11 days after the first broadcast from Voranth Prime, presented a scene his entire career had never once prepared him to witness. The palace complex stood intact, undamaged, its architecture as imposing and ornate as it had been for 3 centuries of unbroken imperial rule. But it sat now largely empty, its vast administrative wings staffed by a skeleton crew of officials who had remained out of uncertainty rather than loyalty, uncertain what authority, if any, still remained above them to answer to. The Emperor himself, Vell learned from the exhausted, overwhelmed remnant of the palace security staff, had not fled in any dramatic fashion. He had simply quietly departed for a private estate on the capital world's southern continent 8 days earlier, accompanied by a small retinue of loyal household staff, and had not issued a single public communication since. There had been no formal abdication. No declaration of surrender, no final defiant stand. Nothing that fit the shape of any ending Vell's understanding of imperial history had prepared him to expect. The emperor had simply stopped, one quiet morning, being an emperor in any functional sense, because the vast administrative and military apparatus that had translated his authority into actual governance across 3 centuries and dozens of subject worlds had, world by world, department by department, simply stopped choosing to participate in the fiction that his authority still meant anything at all. Vell stood for a long time in the empty central chamber where the imperial court had once conducted the business of governing a fifth of known space, and found himself thinking, with a clarity that felt almost like grief, about every campaign he had commanded in the Emperor's name, every subject world brought to heel through the careful, patient application of overwhelming force, all of it resting, it turned out, on a foundation no sturdier than 3 centuries of collective agreement not to look too closely at what was actually holding it up. He convened what remained of the Imperial military command structure 3 days later, in a hastily arranged session that bore almost no resemblance to the formal, ceremony-bound proceedings that had once governed such gatherings, and found the assembled officers looking to him without any formal transfer of authority ever having taken place, as the closest thing to a legitimate voice of continuity the Imperium had left. "I will not pretend to this body that I know precisely what comes next," Vell told them, standing in a chamber that had once hosted the coronation ceremonies of a dozen emperors, and now held perhaps 40 exhausted officers uncertain whether they still commanded anything at all. "But I do not believe our path forward lies in attempting to reassert control over worlds that have already, decisively and without any ambiguity, chosen to stop being part of this Imperium. I have spent 30 years believing that control was the only language strength understood. I have spent the last 2 weeks watching an empire that held that belief more completely than any other structure I have ever served come apart without a single shot fired, because the belief itself was never actually as sound as 3 centuries of unbroken success had allowed us to assume." He paused, and let his gaze move slowly across the assembled officers, gauging, as he had learned to do across decade. Ease of command, exactly how much of what he was about to propose they might actually be willing to accept. "I propose we begin formal negotiations immediately with every subject world that has declared independence, and that we do so honestly, offering recognition rather than demanding a reconquest none of us, I suspect, still genuinely believe this Imperium retains the legitimacy to attempt. Whatever remains of Voranth authority after those negotiations conclude will at least rest on something more durable than fear and isolation. I do not know what that remainder will look like. I know only that I am no longer willing to spend what remains of my service pretending the old foundation was ever as solid as we told ourselves it was." The negotiations that followed took the better part of a year, conducted across dozens of newly independent worlds, each navigating, in their own way, the complicated transition from subject population to sovereign government, and Vell found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, becoming one of the primary architects of an arrangement that bore almost no resemblance to the Imperium he had spent 30 years serving, a loose confederation of formerly subject worlds. The Dorith prominent among them, bound together not by imperial decree but by voluntary treaty, with a dramatically reduced Voranth core retaining only the territories that had chosen, through genuine and verified consent rather than inherited fear, to remain part of a shared political structure at all. Word of what had happened to the Voranth Imperium reached the wider galaxy slowly, in the particular fragmented, half-understood way that news of a distant, complicated political transformation always did, and Vell noted, with a wry appreciation he would not have believed himself capable of a year earlier, how differently the story was told depending on who was telling it. Some accounts framed it as a catastrophic imperial collapse, a cautionary tale of weakness exploited by a hostile foreign power. Others, particularly among the newly independent worlds themselves, told it as a long-overdue liberation, finally accomplished after 3 generations of quiet endurance. Vell found that he no longer had much interest in correcting either version. What mattered to him in the end was simpler than any story could fully capture, that an empire built on controlling what its people were permitted to know had finally met something it had never developed any doctrine to answer, and that the answer had cost, by his own careful count across every world involved in the transition, remarkably few lives, for a political transformation of this scale. He met Director Voss in person for the first time nearly a year after their first tense communication, aboard a small diplomatic vessel anchored in what had once been contested space, and was now, by careful mutual agreement, simply a border between two governments that had chosen, deliberately, never to become enemies in any way either side would need to answer for later. "I owe you an apology, Director," Vell said, "though I suspect it will sound strange coming from someone whose Imperium you helped dismantle." "I'd be curious to hear it anyway, Fleet Marshal," Voss said, and something in her measured, careful expression suggested genuine interest rather than mere politeness. "I spent 30 years believing that any threat capable of ending an empire like mine would announce itself clearly enough to be met with equal force," Vell said. "I built my entire career on that assumption. I commanded fleets, planned campaigns, advised an emperor, all of it resting on the belief that strength was a language spoken through weapons and formations and the willingness to use them decisively. I never once considered that the most dangerous thing a civilization could offer another wasn't a weapon at all. It was simply the truth, given freely to people who had been denied it long enough to forget they had ever been entitled to it." He paused, weighing the next words carefully in a manner that had become, across the difficult year of negotiations, something closer to habit than deliberate effort. "I do not know what to call what your species did to mine, Director. It was not war by any definition my Imperium ever codified, but I am no longer certain it was peace either. I think perhaps it may simply have been something my civilization never developed a word for because we never imagined it was possible." "I think that might be true of most of the galaxy, Fleet Marshal," Voss said. "My own species is still learning what to call it ourselves. We didn't set out to end an empire. We set out to make sure the people living inside it had the same basic right every free civilization takes for granted, the right to know the truth about their own situation and to decide for themselves what to do with it. Everything that followed was simply what happened once that truth was finally allowed to breed. I think, if I'm honest, that's probably the only kind of victory worth building a reputation around. Not the kind you win by being strong enough to force an outcome. The kind that happens because you gave people what they needed to choose it for themselves, and trusted that most of them, given the chance, would choose something better than what they'd been told was their only option." Senna Iller, 3 years later, standing before the newly formed Doroth Assembly's first full session as its elected first speaker, would offer her own account of that transformation in words that Vell, watching the broadcast from a diplomatic posting he had come, somewhat to his own surprise, to genuinely value, found himself returning to often in the years that followed. "We were told for 3 generations that our silence was the price of our safety," she said. "That the Imperium's strength was simply a fact of the universe, unchangeable and eternal, and that anyone who suggested otherwise was inviting a suffering we could not survive. I want this assembly and every generation that follows it to remember exactly how that belief actually ended, not with an army arriving to save us, and not with a single dramatic act of defiance that changed everything overnight. It ended quietly, the moment we were finally allowed to talk to each other honestly, and discovered that the story holding us in place had never actually been as strong as the silence surrounding it. Humanity did not declare war on the Voranth Imperium. They never fired a single shot, never sent a single warship, never asked us for anything in return for what they gave us. They simply refused to believe that our ignorance of our own strength was something worth preserving and trusted us to do the rest ourselves. I think that is the quietest and perhaps the most powerful thing one people has ever done for another. I hope, whatever we build here, we remember to extend that same trust to whoever comes looking for it next." On Earth, the news of the Voranth Imperium's transformation arrived with considerably less fanfare than Director Voss had privately expected, given the scale of what her small, patient initiative had ultimately helped set in motion. There were no parades, no declarations of triumph, no formal announcement that humanity had, through nothing more than careful diplomacy and a willingness to share the truth, quietly reshaped the political fate of a fifth of known space without ever raising a single weapon in anger. Voss found in the years that followed that she preferred it that way. She gave a single, brief address to the UESC Oversight Committee that had authorized the Lantern Initiative in its earliest, most uncertain days, and closed it with words she would return to often in the quiet years of diplomatic work that followed. Long after the Voranth Imperium had settled into its new, considerably smaller and considerably more voluntary shape. "We didn't win a war," she told the committee. "I want to be careful about that distinction because I think it matters more than almost anything else in this report. We simply refused to accept that other people's silence was a permanent condition, and we were patient enough to let the truth do the rest of the work on its own timeline rather than ours. I don't know if every threat this species faces in the years ahead will bend to that same approach. I suspect some of them won't, and I think we should be honest with ourselves about that possibility rather than assuming this outcome proves more than it actually does. But I do believe, watching what happened across Voranth space this past year, that we've learned something important about the kind of strength that actually lasts. Fear holds an empire together for exactly as long as no one looks too closely at what's underneath it. Truth, once it's finally allowed to breathe, tends to hold rather longer than that. I think that's worth remembering the next time we're deciding what kind of neighbor we want to be, out here among people who are only just beginning to learn what our species is actually capable of. Fleet Marshal Vell, some years later, would find himself telling a very different version of the same lesson to a new generation of officers serving under the modest, voluntary confederation that had grown, slowly and imperfectly, out of the old Imperium's ashes. Young men and women who had never known the Voranth Imperium at the height of its unbroken dominance, and who sometimes struggled to understand exactly how an empire that had once commanded a fifth of known space could have come apart so completely without a single major battle ever being fought. "You will spend your careers being taught to measure strength in fleets and formations," he told them, standing in a modest training hall that bore no resemblance to the ornate ceremonial chambers of the empire he had once served. "I want you to remember, before you accept that measure remen, T2 completely, that the largest political structure I ever served fell not to a superior fleet, but to a species that understood something my own civilization had spent 3 centuries refusing to learn, that no empire built on controlling what its people are allowed to know can ever truly call itself secure, no matter how many warships stand at its border. Humanity never declared war on us. They simply gave the people we had spent generations silencing the chance to speak, and trusted the truth to do what 3 centuries of imperial force never actually managed. It ended us more completely and more permanently than any invasion fleet could have. I have come to believe in the years since that it was also, in its own quiet way, the most honest thing anyone has ever done for us. I hope you carry that lesson further than my own generation ever managed to."